It was one of those rare cold nights in Hollywood, the kind that made the city feel abandoned, like a ghost town. The streets, usually alive with chatter and lights, were eerily quiet as I drove home after my late shift as a restaurant manager. I had covered for a sick colleague, which meant working extra hours, and by the time I clocked out, it was nearly 2 a.m. Exhaustion weighed heavy on me, my mind foggy, my body yearning for the warmth of my bed. As I turned onto Kinna Boulevard, the streetlights stretched their shadows across the road, creating eerie shapes that seemed to twist and move. The buildings flanking the street stood silent, their windows dark like watchful eyes. The air felt oppressive, thick with an unease I couldn't shake. "It's just the fatigue," I muttered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. As I approached a stop sign 3 blocks from Hollywood Boulevard, I instinctively slowed down. This was a route I knew well, yet tonight, the silence felt unnatural, almost threatening. My car's engine hummed softly in the stillness, the only sound breaking the quiet. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. Out of the shadows, a group of men began to emerge, their figures slowly materializing under the dim streetlights. They moved with an unsettling casualness, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. 5, maybe 6 of them, all dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured. Panic gripped me. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. The way they moved, slow and deliberate, felt predatory. They weren't in a rush, as if savoring the moment, their steps measured like hunters closing in on their prey. Instinct screamed at me to act, but fear rooted me in place. The men spread out, forming a line across the road, cutting off my path. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, each second dragging on as they advanced. Without warning, my survival instincts took over. My foot slammed down on the gas pedal, and the tires screeched as the car surged forward, breaking through the intersection. For a fleeting second, I caught a glimpse of their faces twisted in rage, mouths shouting curses I couldn't hear over the roar of the engine. They gave chase. In the rearview mirror, I saw them running after me, their dark forms illuminated briefly by the taillights. I didn't dare look back again. My only focus was on escaping, getting away from whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. The car roared down the deserted streets, the speedometer climbing as adrenaline coursed through my veins. The cold fear clung to me like a second skin, making every shadow feel alive, every turn feel like a trap. When I was several blocks away, I finally dared to slow down. The rearview mirror showed nothing but empty streets, yet the fear lingered. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I pulled into a well-lit parking lot, shutting off the engine. Sitting there in the silence, the reality of what had just happened hit me. My body trembled as I replayed the encounter in my mind, the way they appeared out of nowhere, the malice in their movements, the cold look in their eyes. What had they planned to do? Rob me? Or something worse? I shuddered at the thought. If I had hesitated even for a moment, I might not be alive to tell this story. It was a grim reminder of how quickly a routine night can turn into a fight for survival. When I finally made it home, I locked the door behind me, feeling the fragile safety of my small apartment. But the fear hadn't completely left me. Even now, every time I drive down that street, a chill runs down my spine, and I'm reminded of that night, a close brush with the darkness lurking just beyond the shadows. He stood there, frozen in place, his figure stark against the darkness. It was almost as if he had been expecting them. The officers stepped out of their vehicle, their movements cautious but deliberate. One of them approached him, flashlight in hand, while the other lingered near the car, keeping a watchful eye on the scene. "Sir, what are you doing here?" the first officer asked, his voice calm but firm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his hollow eyes flickering between the officer and the shadows around him. For a moment, it seemed like he was trying to process the question, as if the words didn't quite register. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, raspy whisper. "Just looking." "Looking for what?" the officer pressed, stepping closer. The man's gaze darted around erratically, his thin frame trembling under the cold night air. "I don't know," he mumbled, almost to himself. "I just need to find it." A chill ran down my spine. His words were nonsensical, but there was something about the way he said them, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The second officer moved toward him, now holding out a pair of handcuffs. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." As the officer reached for his arm, the man's demeanor shifted. He jerked back violently, his thin body suddenly radiating a strength that seemed impossible for someone so frail. "No," he shouted, his voice raw and animalistic. "You can't stop me. I have to find it." The officers reacted quickly, trying to restrain him, but he thrashed against them with a wild, almost inhuman energy. His movements were erratic, his limbs flailing as he screamed incoherently. For a moment, it felt like the situation was spiraling out of control. I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding as I watched the struggle unfold. The man's voice rang out, sharp and guttural, cutting through the silence of the night. He wasn't just resisting, he was fighting like his life depended on it. Eventually, the officers managed to pin him to the ground, their voices firm but measured as they restrained him. Even then, he continued to struggle, his voice growing hoarse as he shouted words that made no sense. "I can't stop," he screamed. "It's here. It's watching." The officers exchanged uneasy glances before lifting him to his feet and guiding him toward the patrol car. His head hung low, but his body remained tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. As they loaded him into the back seat, one of the officers approached me. "Do you know this man?" he asked. I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper.
"No."
"I've never seen him before." The officer nodded, his expression serious. "We've had reports of unusual behavior in the area recently. Probably just someone strung out on something, but you did the right thing calling us." I nodded, though his words did little to ease the unease that had settled in my chest. As the police car drove away, its lights disappearing into the distance, I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty street. The night felt quieter than before, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the man was just another troubled soul in need of help. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him. Something darker, something I didn't understand. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I locked the door and double-checked the windows, the man's wild eyes still etched in my mind. The quiet streets outside no longer felt safe. Even now, I can't help but wonder what he was looking for that night, or why he seemed so certain that he'd find it. The officers cautiously asked him for ID, but he simply stood there, silent and unresponsive, his wide, vacant eyes fixed on them. When he refused to comply, they exchanged a brief glance before stepping forward to detain him. Strangely, he didn't resist. Without a word, he let them guide him to the back of the police car. As the vehicle pulled away, the unsettling quiet of the night returned, even deeper than before. I lingered for a moment, trying to shake the lingering unease. This was supposed to be a safe place, a sanctuary. But that night, I learned a hard truth. No place is ever completely safe. Darkness always lurks at the edges, waiting for its chance to surface. Years earlier, when I was 18, I found myself standing alone on an empty highway at 1 a.m., desperately hoping for a ride. The road stretched endlessly before me, a black ribbon cutting through the cold, silent night. The only sounds were the rustling wind and the occasional swish of leaves brushing against each other. The chill bit through my clothes, but I ignored it. I just needed to get home. I'd spent the evening visiting a friend in a small town about 50 miles away and had completely lost track of time. Though my friend had offered me a place to stay, I foolishly declined, thinking I'd make it home before it got too late. Now, I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no streetlights, no passing cars, and no sign of life. Just me and the overwhelming darkness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Anxiety began to creep in, my heartbeat thundering in my ears like a drum. Desperation was starting to set in when, finally, I spotted headlights in the distance. A wave of relief washed over me as the vehicle approached and slowed to a stop beside me. The driver rolled down his window, revealing an elderly man with deeply lined features and snow-white hair. His voice, rough and gravelly, broke the silence. "Need a ride?" he asked. I hesitated, my instincts urging caution, but the biting cold and the isolation outweighed my reservations. I nodded and climbed into the car, shutting the door behind me. The old man smiled faintly, revealing yellowed, uneven teeth, before shifting the car into gear. The engine hummed softly as we started down the road. At first, the ride was quiet, and I was grateful for it. Exhaustion weighed on me, and I didn't feel like making conversation. All I wanted was to get home. The highway was deserted, the headlights piercing through the inky blackness, illuminating rows of trees on either side. Their shadows danced and twisted in the beam, creating unsettling shapes that played tricks on my tired eyes. Breaking the silence, the man finally spoke. "So, where are you headed?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Home," I replied softly, avoiding his eyes. "It's about 30 miles from here." He nodded slowly. "You live with your parents?" "Yes," I answered hesitantly. A flicker of unease crept in. I didn't want to share too much with a stranger, but I also didn't want to come across as rude. The man's nod was measured, as though considering something. "You must be a good kid, heading home this late," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Don't see that much these days." I forced a polite smile, but his words unsettled me. Something about the way he spoke, the cadence of his voice, the weight of his gaze, made my skin crawl. Then his questions turned more pointed. "So, what do your parents do for a living?" I hesitated again, trying to keep my discomfort hidden. "They work," I said curtly. "What kind of work?" he pressed, his eyes darting to me briefly before returning to the road. "Business," I muttered vaguely, hoping he'd drop the subject. The air in the car grew heavier with each exchange. I glanced at his hands gripping the steering wheel and froze. His sleeves were stained. Dark, crusted patches smeared across his cuffs and shirt front. It looked disturbingly like dried blood. My heart leapt into my throat. A shiver of dread coursed through me, and I managed to stammer, Is that blood?" For a moment, the man didn't answer, his expression unreadable as he kept his focus on the road. Then, with a voice disturbingly calm, he replied, "It's not mine." His words hung in the air like a death knell, sending icy fear straight to my core. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? What had he done? But there was no time for answers. I knew I needed to get out of that car, fast. "Please let me out here," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. The old man didn't respond immediately. His grip on the wheel tightened ever so slightly, and I held my breath. But then, with a slow nod, he murmured, "All right." He pulled over to the side of the road, the car coming to a gentle stop. Wasting no time, I flung the door open and stumbled out, my legs trembling beneath me as I hit the pavement. "Thank you," I muttered, barely audible, before I started walking quickly down the highway without looking back. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my breaths came in short gasps. I heard the sound of the car door closing and the engine revving softly as the vehicle drove away. Only when I was certain it was gone did I allow myself to breathe fully again. I made it home that night, unharmed, but the fear lingered, embedding itself deep in my bones. For weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of that ride. The old man's unsettling questions, the blood on his clothes, the eerie calm in his voice, it all haunted me. Even now, years later, the terror of that night hasn't faded. It's a grim reminder of a simple truth. Some risks aren't worth taking. "I'll never hitchhike again." He nodded slowly, as if considering something. "You must be a good kid heading home this late. Don't see many young folks doing that these days." I forced a smile, but deep down, I wasn't sure why I felt so uneasy. His tone, his words, everything about him made me feel on edge. But I tried to push the thought away, telling myself I was just being paranoid. He was just an old man, probably lonely, just wanting someone to talk to. Then, his questions became more personal. "So, what do your parents do for a living?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "They work," I answered vaguely. "What kind of work?" His eyes flicked towards me for a brief moment, then quickly returned to the road. "They're in business," I said, trying to keep the answer short. My discomfort grew with each question, but I didn't want to show it. The old man nodded again, but this time his smile didn't reach his eyes. It felt wrong, unsettling. My heart raced, and I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing down at his hands on the steering wheel. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Dark stains on his shirt, smeared across the sleeves. It looked like dried blood. My breath caught in my throat. "Is that blood?" I asked, my voice trembling. The old man didn't answer immediately. He just kept driving, his gaze fixed on the road. After what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "It's not mine," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. His words sent a wave of terror crashing over me. My mind raced with questions. Who is this man? What had he done? Panic bubbled up in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. I knew I needed to get out of the car, but we were still on that desolate highway. No other cars in sight, no houses, no help. I didn't know where to turn. Finally, I found the courage to speak. "Please, let me out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear clawing at me. The old man didn't respond at first, still driving, the empty road stretching on forever. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing like a hammer in my ears. I was terrified that he wouldn't let me go, that he had something else planned for me. After a few moments, he nodded slowly. "All right," he muttered, his voice low and gruff. He pulled the car over to the side of the road and stopped. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. Without hesitation, I threw open the door, my legs shaking as I stepped onto the cold asphalt. "Thank you," I muttered, barely able to get the words out. Then, without looking back, I started walking down the road, my heart racing with every step. I heard the car door slam shut behind me, and the engine roared to life as the old man drove off. I didn't stop walking until I was certain he was gone. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. That night, I made it home unharmed. But the fear lingered long after I closed the door behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly terrible. The memory of that ride haunted me for weeks. The old man's unsettling questions, the blood on his clothes, his too calm voice. Even now, years later, I can still feel the terror of that night. I've never hitchhiked again, and I never will. Some risks simply aren't worth taking.
Please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks.